Welcome to Avoiding Common Punctuation and Grammar Mistakes. I'm Dave, I'm your host, and Linda will be our instructor today. Today's webinar is brought to you by the New York State and CSCA Partnership for Education and Training, or many of you know us as the Partnership. So some of you might wonder what the Partnership is. Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Partnership is a joint organization that administers education and training programs for CSEA represented employees through a labor management co-op. We're funded through a negotiated agreement between New York State and CSEA. The partnership offers in-person classroom training, online learning, educational advisement services, grants, tuition benefits, labor management services, and other education and training programs, including the webinar that you're about to attend. In essence, the partnership is a joint labor management organization whose mission is to promote career mobility. It's to improve your job skills, support your workplace safety and health, and to promote effective labor management relations. You can learn more about us at our website, which you see on the screen, or by calling us directly at the 800 number you see on the screen.
My name is Linda Ween. I've been an instructor at Capital Region Language Center in Albany for 14 years, where I teach English. I specialize in grammar and professional writing. So let's get into today's topic. We're going to discuss why it's important to take time to improve your grammar and punctuation skills. We'll provide you with tips and strategies to use punctuation like apostrophes and commas correctly in your sentences. We'll also spend some time helping you recognize and avoid the most common grammar mistakes that people make in business writing. As we go along, you're probably going to find that you've already mastered some of these grammar and punctuation rules. Others you may not be as aware of, and you'll have to learn more about them. However, this webinar won't cover all the rules of punctuation and grammar. If you want to learn more about this topic, you may want to take the full day in-person class called Grammar and Punctuation Workshop when it's next offered in your area. If you say the word grammar out loud, there's probably someone in the room who will feel a bit panicked. You may be feeling that way yourself. Let's face it, studying English grammar isn't always fun. It can be complex, difficult, sometimes even boring. So why do we bother? Well, I'd like to ask you a question. What do you think happens when people notice that a person uses poor grammar and punctuation? In other words, when they make a lot of these mistakes in their writing. I would call your attention to two general categories of problem. One is unprofessional, careless, uneducated. Two is poor communication. Grammar and punctuation help us to communicate clearly and accurately. We have many grammar and punctuation rules that really exist for one good reason: to bring clarity to our communication. Grammar is the heart of written and spoken communication. The more you understand it, the more people understand you. In addition to clarity, there's another reason. Your writing skills say something about you to other people. Grammatical errors are distracting, and honestly, they annoy some people. Also, if you make grammatical or punctuation errors on a regular basis, it will make you seem careless and sloppy. But remember, your grammar and punctuation can be improved with a little practice. If you spend some time practicing these things, your emails and reports will stand out, and your writing in general will improve. We've done some research and have found the top grammar and punctuation mistakes that most people make. Those are the areas we'll be focusing on today. Additionally, I really like the idea of writing down the punctuation and grammar errors that I often make, and then keeping them by my desk to remind me to check for them when I write. In fact, why don't you get out a piece of paper right now? As we go along today, start a quick list of the things that trip you up the most. I'd like to start by looking at problems having to do with possessives and contractions. These mistakes all involve a bit of punctuation known as the apostrophe. Generally, apostrophes have two purposes: showing possession or contractions. The first use of apostrophes is to show possession or ownership of something. The top sentence says, Tyler's bike. Tyler owns the bike, so it's Tyler's with an apostrophe. The second reason we generally use apostrophes is for contractions. A contraction is when we leave out some letters in two words and make it into a single word. For example, instead of saying I am tired in the second sentence, we say I'm tired with an apostrophe. We've just mentioned that apostrophes are used for both contractions and possessives. Here's an example. They're happy with the project. Which do you think there is, a contraction or a possessive? There are a few exceptions to the use of apostrophes for possession, but the one you're most likely to run into is for personal pronouns. Personal pronouns are words like I, you, he, she, it, we, and they. Instead of adding just an apostrophe or apostrophe with an S to these personal pronouns, they change slightly to reflect ownership. I becomes my or mine. He becomes his. We becomes our or ours. You probably know these changes and use them all the time. However, there are a few that are trickier: your, its, and their. The reason those three cause problems is because we also have words that sound exactly the same, but use an apostrophe because they are contractions. And for most of us, when we want to show possession, we are used to using an apostrophe. On the screen, you see the possessive personal pronouns we talked about a moment ago with their sound-alike contractions. For example, your and your. Because we know that possessive personal pronouns don't use apostrophes, we can feel more confident knowing that the words with apostrophes are contractions. Let's look at the sentences at the bottom of the screen. The cat played with its ball. Many people are tempted to write its with an apostrophe, but that's incorrect because its is a contraction for it is. Here's my pro tip for this common error. If you want to remember which of the pair of words you should be using, try replacing the contraction with the full phrase, such as it is. The cat played with it is ball. Does that make sense? No. If not, it's a possessive pronoun, and you should skip the apostrophe. Next topic I'd like to discuss is common subject and verb agreement mistakes. But first, it may help us to understand things better if we do a quick review of simple sentences. A sentence, in its simplest form, has a subject and a verb. The verb is the action part of the sentence. Usually, it's easiest to find the verb first and then figure out who or what does the action. That's the subject. For example, in the sentence, the dog bites, we see that bites is the action. Who or what bites? The dog. So dog is the subject. Of course, sentences can get much more complicated than this, but let's just start by keeping these two crucial parts of a sentence in mind as we look at the next slide. Now let's discuss common subject-verb agreement mistakes. The key idea is that the subject and the verb need to agree. In other words, we need to use the form of the verb that matches the subject. The basic rule is that singular subjects or nouns take singular verb forms. Singular subjects include pronouns like I or he, or nouns like Sam or the clerk. Subject-verb agreement in this case would include things like I am or Sam runs. Plural subjects take the plural version of the verb, such as they are or we run. Remember, though, it may seem odd. A singular subject generally takes the verb with an S, and a plural subject generally takes the verb without the S in the present tense. For example, the clerk in blue types, but the lively clerks type. Let's stop and see how you're doing with this idea. Remember, subject-verb agreement means that if your subject is singular, the verb should be singular too. The same applies for a plural subject and verb. Look at the sentence on the screen. Is or are the governor's news conference on at 10 or 11? In your opinion, should the verb be is or are? In more complex sentences, it can be harder to figure out what the subject actually is. When this happens, it helps to narrow the information down to what we call the simple subject. The simple subject is the noun or pronoun that the sentence is talking about. This is important because the simple subject almost always determines whether the verb is singular or plural. The agency's portfolio of early documents is on display in the New York State Museum until June. Sometimes there are words in the sentence that describe the noun, such as the words agencies and of early documents that can be stripped away. If you focus on the verb and ask who or what is doing the action, it can help remove the confusion. In the example on the screen, ask, what is on display? The answer might be the portfolio of early documents. Next, ask which is the simple subject, the word portfolio or documents. This is an important question because if I'm not sure, I won't know whether I should use a singular or plural verb. In this case, the phrase of early documents can be removed since it is just a way to describe the portfolio. Since the simple subject is the word portfolio, then the singular verb is would be used here. Okay, let's practice finding the simple subject. Take a moment and figure out what the simple subject is in the sentence, the waterfalls of Watkins Glen State Park is or are unforgettable. Collective nouns are words that refer to a countable group of people or things, but that act as a single entity. Examples include flock or committee. Collective nouns are considered singular and take a singular verb. It may seem a bit odd that it's singular when we're talking about a group of people or animals. The trick is to remember that it's acting like a single unit. So when the collective entity such as a committee, is acting as a single unit, such as when it's voting on a proposal, it is treated as a singular noun. For example, the committee votes on the proposals. Another example would be the executive team is happy with its performance. Let's test your knowledge. Take a look at the sentence on the screen. The legislature are voting on a bill. I'd like you to notice that it has the collective noun legislature in it. Is it correct? Next, I'd like to talk about sentence clauses and how they contribute to common punctuation and grammar mistakes. Phrases and clauses are the building blocks of sentences, but they are different from each other. A phrase is a group of words that does not have a subject and a verb. A clause does have a subject and verb. Usually, when we get in trouble with punctuation, it involves a clause. So let's focus on them. Independent clauses express a complete thought, and they could stand alone as a sentence. Dependent clauses will have a subject and a verb, but they will depend on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So a simple sentence like the dog bites is an independent clause and could be a sentence on its own. Dependent clauses such as because it is mean can't stand on their own. There is a subject and a verb in the clause because it is mean, but without the first part of the sentence, we wouldn't know what was going on. What happens because it is mean? It helps me to remember the difference between the two by thinking of the independent clause like a parent who is an independent person. Think of a dependent clause like a dependent child. The child needs the parent in order to stand. I'd like to stop for a moment and see if you understand this idea. Take a look at the clause on the screen in the bold orange letters. Even though it wasn't due yet. Is this an independent clause or a dependent clause? Let's talk about sentences now that are made up of two independent clauses. That means that each clause could stand on its own as a sentence. However, when they are written as two separate sentences, the ideas in the two clauses can seem unrelated or only semi-related. For example, her dog is excited. It won't sit still. But if the information in the two clauses is closely related, we may want to join them together into one sentence. We'll need to add something if we want them to be part of the same sentence. For example, we could use a semicolon between them as we did in the second example. Her dog is excited. It won't sit still. However, we should not use a comma to join two independent clauses. This is a very common mistake called a comma splice. But here's the exception. I'm going to change that to say, don't use a comma between independent clauses unless one of the fanboys is between them. So what on earth are grammatical fanboys? Let's take a look at the sentence. Her dog is excited and it won't sit still. The word and is one of the fanboys. The 7 fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Fanboys have another name, and that is coordinating conjunctions. Conjunctions are words that join phrases or clauses together. But for now, just learn the fanboys acronym to help you remember the rule. The two independent clauses work together in this sentence because the information they're talking about is closely related. In the example, since we are using the fanboys conjunction or joining word and between them, we will use a comma. If you were to drop the fanboys word, you would end up with a comma splice. The next mistake people tend to make when joining clauses is to use too many commas. Once we learn the rules about using commas when there is a fanboys conjunction joining two independent clauses, we tend to start using commas every time we see a joining word. This generally happens when there is an independent and a dependent clause that we want to join together. However, you should not use a comma when you see dependent marker words like after, when, although, or because. These words are actually another type of conjunction. I'd have you notice they're not fanboys words. A dependent clause often starts with one of these dependent clause markers, which are called subordinating conjunctions. In the example on the screen, we can see that the first clause is in orange. The woman never went into the city, could stand on its own. The second one in green, because she didn't feel comfortable driving in traffic, is a dependent clause. If you read the last part out loud, because she didn't feel comfortable driving in traffic, you'll see it doesn't make sense without the rest of the sentence. Remember how we imagined adults and children when we discussed independent and dependent clauses. Think of this situation as a parent and child. You shouldn't separate them. The child adds meaning to the adult, but is dependent and not able to stand alone. Let's do a quick quiz. The sentence on the screen says, the team was exhausted after the meeting was over. Is this sentence correct, or do we need a comma? The final punctuation and grammar mistakes we'll talk about relate specifically to sentence structure. Run-on sentences are very common mistakes that people make. They happen when we squash two complete sentences together without using a coordinating fanboys, conjunction, and comma, or a period or semicolon. On the screen, we have an example of a run-on sentence. I left for work early, I missed the train anyway. Run-on sentences can make your writing into a block of words that becomes confusing to read. There are a couple of ways to fix them. Sometimes you can fix the sentence by using a fanboys conjunction and a comma, as we spoke about a moment ago. In the first correct example, I left for work early, but I missed the train anyway. In this case, we added a comma and the fanboys word but. However, to make your ideas clearer and easier to understand, it's often best to break the run-on into two different sentences. In other words, make two good sentences out of one long run-on. In the second correct example, we separated this sentence with a period. Remember, this works because they are two independent clauses. Remember that the longer the sentence, the harder it is to read, even if it is grammatically correct. In the workplace, it's best to keep your writing clear and concise. Short and sweet is best. I want to suggest another tip here. When you read out loud, you may quickly notice that you have a run-on sentence. When I read the first sentence, I left for work early, I missed the train anyway. You can hear that that's not right. Something is wrong. You can't have all that in one sentence. So then it's your job to figure out how to correct it. Let's check your understanding. Is this a run-on sentence? I didn't know which computer I wanted. I was too confused to decide. Now let's talk about sentence fragments. Sentence fragment errors probably appear on every list of common writing mistakes. When I spoke about sentences a bit earlier, I mentioned that they need to at least have a subject and a verb. When that doesn't happen, it's called a sentence fragment. We may use a capital letter at the beginning and a period at the end when we do this, but it still isn't a complete sentence. For example, the phrase in orange, in spite of everything, doesn't have a subject or a verb. Sometimes, though, a fragment does have a subject and verb, but it doesn't express a complete idea, as a sentence must do. In other words, it is a dependent clause, written as if it were a complete sentence. When we make a sentence fragment type of mistake, it can often be fixed by connecting it to a nearby sentence. Let's look at the first incorrect example. He gave his mother an expensive gift after the argument does express a complete idea on its own. It also has a subject and a verb. The phrase in spite of everything doesn't do either of these things, so it's only a part of a sentence or a sentence fragment. If you read the orange phrase, in spite of everything out loud, you can hear that it needs more to make sense. Now let's look at the first correct example. The sentence fragment problem here has been fixed by using a comma. He gave his mother an expensive gift after the argument, comma, in spite of everything. This worked because the two ideas are closely related and make sense together. If there isn't a sentence that you can attach a fragment to, you will have to change it so that it has a subject and a verb. In the second correct example, adding he loved her to the phrase in spite of everything makes it a whole sentence. The two sentences become, he gave his mother an expensive gift after the argument. He loved her in spite of everything. He is the subject and loved is the verb. It's a good habit to go back through your writing and make sure that each sentence has a subject and a verb. We've covered a lot of punctuation and grammar mistakes, as well as tips to avoid or fix them. Before we wrap up, here's one more general tip. Use a grammar checker. A grammar checker is a tool to help you catch grammar mistakes, such as sentence fragments and run-on sentences. Microsoft Office products like Word and Outlook have grammar checkers built in. You just have to make sure they're turned on. You can also use other grammar checkers like Grammarly, which is an online program. However, even the best grammar checker will make mistakes from time to time, suggesting that there are errors with none exist. Should you use one? Absolutely. One of the things I like best about using a grammar checker when I write is that I start to notice the mistakes that I tend to make. We will have to find ways to practice our new skills. As with any skill, we must intentionally practice it to progress and get better at it. Well, I hope you've learned some good ideas, and I'd like to share some final tips and resources that I personally use that will help you practice your new skills. Explore the two online resources on the slide, the Purdue Online Writing Lab and the Daily Grammar Lessons. Keep that list of common errors at your desk. Finally, If you're interested in learning more, consider taking some of the partnership's other classes on writing skills, such as writing effectively or expanding your vocabulary.